Hello, dear listeners. Welcome back to Blue Flame, your home for true, chilling, and unforgettable bedtime stories. If you enjoy tales that linger in your mind long after the lights go out, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Your support helps us bring more hauntingly real stories to your quiet nights. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let the shadows whisper. Cemetery Gate opens itself. It was the last week of October in the year 2025, a time when the air in rural Vermont carries the sharp scent of fallen leaves, damp earth, and wood smoke curling from distant chimneys. The sun had already begun its early retreat behind the Green Mountains, casting long, wavering shadows across the winding backroads of Addison County. In the small town of Bridport, population barely over 1,000, most folks had long since pulled their curtains shut against the gathering dusk. But not Eloan Voss. Eloan was not one for early bedtimes or superstition. At 43, she worked as a historical archivist for the county, spending her days poring over brittle letters, faded photographs, and land deeds that stretched back to the 1800s. She lived alone in a weathered farmhouse just outside town, inherited from her great-aunt Miriam, who had passed quietly in her sleep 3 winters prior. Eloan often joked that the house had more ghosts than neighbors, but she never truly believed in them. Not until that evening. She had been visiting the Bridport Hillside Cemetery to photograph a newly uncovered headstone from the 1700s. The stone, partially buried beneath ivy and decades of leaf litter, bore the name Thaddeus Hargrave and a date so worn it was nearly illegible. Local lore claimed Thaddeus had been a reclusive tanner who vanished one autumn night, never to be seen again, though his grave had been prepared in advance, as if he'd known his time was short. Eloan found the mystery irresistible. She arrived just past 5 o'clock, when the golden hour was fading into a bruised purple twilight. The cemetery, nestled on a gentle slope overlooking Otter Creek, was enclosed by a wrought iron fence that had stood since the late 1800s. Its main gate, a heavy, black-painted affair with curling scrollwork and a rusted latch, had not been opened in years. Town records showed it was welded shut in 1992 after repeated vandalism. Everyone used the side path now, a narrow trail worn into the grass by generations of mourners. Eloan parked her dented Subaru at the edge of the gravel road and walked the familiar path, camera slung over her shoulder, breath misting in the crisp air. Crickets had begun their evening chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a barred owl called, a low, mournful hoot that seemed to echo off the hills. She reached the ivy-covered stone just as the last light bled from the sky. Kneeling, she brushed away dirt with gloved fingers, careful not to damage the fragile inscription. Then she heard it, a metallic groan, deep, resonant, and utterly out of place. She froze. From the direction of the main gate, a slow, grinding creak echoed through the stillness, followed by the unmistakable sound of iron hinges turning. But that was impossible. The gate hadn't moved in over 30 years. Heart hammering, Eloan stood slowly, turning toward the sound. Through the skeletal branches of ancient oaks, she saw it, the cemetery's main gate, wide open. Not just ajar, fully swung inward, as though someone had pushed it with deliberate force. Yet there was no one there. No footprints in the dew-damp grass leading to or from it. No breeze strong enough to move such a heavy structure. The air was utterly still. She called out, "Hello." Her voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast quiet. No answer. Eloan took a step forward, then another, her boots crunching softly on dry leaves. As she neared the gate, a cold draft swept past her, unnatural, localized, as if the wind had been waiting just for her. Goosebumps rose on her arms despite her thick wool coat. She glanced back at Thaddeus Hargrave's stone. It looked different now, darker, as though shadow had pooled around its base. Then from inside the cemetery came a whisper. Not words, just breath. A sigh that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Eloan's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet remained rooted. She had spent her life chasing history, believing it to be dead and harmless. But history, she realized in that moment, was not always content to stay buried. She backed away slowly, eyes locked on the open gate. Just as she reached her car, she turned for one last look. The gate was closed again, tightly shut, as if it had never moved at all. But when she returned the next morning with the town's maintenance supervisor, they found something strange. The latch, long rusted solid, was smeared with fresh, damp earth. And pressed into the soft ground just inside the gate was a single footprint. Too large to be a child's. Too old-fashioned in shape to belong to anyone living. Eloan never returned to that cemetery alone again. Yet every year, on the last evening of October, just as twilight falls, she drives past Bridport Hillside Cemetery. And every year, without fail, she sees the same thing. The gate standing wide open, waiting. No one else ever sees it, but she does. And she knows, some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Weeks passed after that October evening, but the image of the open gate refused to fade from Eloan Voss's mind. It clung to her like morning fog, persistent, damp, and impossible to shake. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the latch had finally given way after decades of rust. Maybe a raccoon or a stray dog had nudged it loose. But deep down, in the quiet hours before dawn when the house creaked and the wind sighed through the eaves, she knew better. Iron didn't groan like that. Gates didn't swing open on their own in windless air. And footprints didn't appear out of nowhere, especially not barefoot ones that left no trail leading away. By mid-November, the first snow dusted the hills of Bridport like powdered sugar over old bones. Eloan buried herself in work, cataloging Civil War-era letters donated by a local family. But even among ink-stained pages and faded postmarks, her thoughts kept drifting back to Thaddeus Hargrave. Who was he really? Why had his grave been prepared before his disappearance? And why did his name echo in her dreams like a half-remembered song? One rainy afternoon, while sorting through a box of unmarked documents in the county archives, she found something unexpected, a brittle, yellowed journal wrapped in oilcloth. The cover bore no title, only a single initial, T. Her pulse quickened. She opened it with gloved hands, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The handwriting was spidery, precise, and dated October 28, 1763. I have seen the gate, the first entry read. It opened without hand or wind. I stood at the edge of the burying ground and watched it swing inward, as though beckoning. I did not enter. I dare not. But I feel it watching me still. Eloan's breath caught. She flipped through the pages. Entry after entry described the same phenomenon. The gate opening at dusk, always when Thaddeus was alone. He wrote of cold spots in his workshop, of tools moving on their own, of whispers in the tannery at night. In his final entry, dated November 1st, 1763, he wrote, "It knows my name. It waits. If I am not seen again, know this, I did not flee. I was called." There was no record of his death. No obituary. No church burial note. Just this journal, and a grave with his name carved deep into slate. That night, unable to sleep, Eloan drove back to the cemetery. Not close, just enough to see it from the road. The snow had melted, leaving the ground slick and glistening under a half moon. She parked beneath a maple tree, engine off, windows fogging. She watched. Waited. At exactly 6 minutes past 6, the gate creaked open. Not slowly this time. Not with hesitation. It swung wide with a single resonant groan, as if impatient. Eloan didn't move. She barely breathed. From her vantage point, she could see the path leading inward, flanked by leaning headstones and skeletal yews. And there, just beyond the threshold, stood a figure, tall, thin, dressed in rough-spun wool, the kind worn in the 1700s. His back was to her, but she knew, somehow, she knew it was Thaddeus. He did not turn. He simply stood, as if waiting for someone to follow. Then, as suddenly as it had opened, the gate slammed shut with a crash that echoed across the valley. The figure vanished. Eloan sat frozen for nearly an hour, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. When she finally drove home, her tires left twin tracks in the mud, tracks that led away from the cemetery, but none that led toward it. The next day, she visited the town historian, an elderly man named Corwin Pembleton who had lived in Bridport his entire life. His house smelled of pipe tobacco and dried herbs, and his eyes narrowed when she mentioned Thaddeus Hargrave. "Ah," he said slowly, stirring his tea. "That name's best left in the ground." He told her a story rarely spoken aloud. In the autumn of 1763, 3 children went missing from Bridport within the span of a week. No signs of struggle. No ransom notes. Just gone. The townsfolk suspected foul play, but suspicion turned to fear when Thaddeus Hargrave claimed he'd seen the watcher near the cemetery, a tall man in old clothes who never cast a shadow. Days later, Thaddeus disappeared too. But here's what the records never said. Before he vanished, Thaddeus had been seen digging a grave. Not for himself. For someone else. A 4th grave, unmarked, just beyond the eastern wall of the cemetery. "Some say he made a bargain," Corwin murmured, lowering his voice as if the walls might listen. "He offered himself so the children would be spared. But bargains with things that walk in graveyards, they're never truly finished." Eloan left his house with more questions than answers. That evening, she returned to the archives and cross-referenced burial plots. Sure enough, there was a gap in the eastern section, 4 feet wide, untouched by headstones or flowers. The ground there was always slightly sunken, even after heavy rains. She began visiting the cemetery every Sunday at dusk, always from a distance, always with her camera. Week after week, the gate remained closed. Until the first Sunday of January. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees below zero. Frost feathered the windows of her car. The world was silent. No birds, no wind, not even the distant hum of traffic. Just stillness. Absolute and watchful. Then at 6:02, the gate opened. This time, it didn't just swing. It yawned wide, as if the earth itself had exhaled. And from the darkness beyond, a voice called. Not loud. Not angry. Just a single word, carried on air too cold to hold sound. Eloan. Her name. Spoken in a voice dry as autumn leaves and old as stone. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat had closed tight with terror. But she knew this wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. Thaddeus wasn't just appearing. He was reaching out. And he knew who she was. That night, she dreamed of the unmarked grave. In the dream, she stood at its edge, shovel in hand. The earth was soft, eager. And as she dug, something reached up, not a hand, but roots, black and sinewy, curling around her wrist like fingers. She woke gasping, her sheets soaked in sweat despite the winter chill. On her nightstand, her phone displayed a notification. A photo had been saved automatically. She hadn't taken any pictures. But there it was, a shot from her camera, time-stamped 3:15 a.m. The image showed the cemetery gate, wide open. And standing just inside, facing the lens, was a man in a long coat, his face blurred as if caught between moments. Behind him, the unmarked grave glowed faintly, as though something beneath it was breathing. Eloan deleted the photo. It reappeared the next morning. She stopped sleeping. She started carrying salt in her pockets, a habit she'd read about in folklore. She hung iron nails above her doors, though she laughed at herself for it. But laughter didn't stop the whispers that now followed her in empty rooms. It didn't explain why her reflection in the mirror sometimes blinked a second too late. One evening, while reviewing old land deeds, she found a clause buried in a property transfer from 1764. It stated that the Hargrave plot was bound not by soil, but by silence, and that any who speak his name thrice at the gate shall open the way. She had never spoken his name aloud at the cemetery, but someone, or something, had heard her think it. On the night of February 2nd, Groundhog Day, the sky cleared to a starless black. Eloan knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the winter air, that she had to go back. Not to watch, not to photograph, but to face it. She parked at the usual spot, walked to the fence, stood before the gate. It was closed. She took a breath. "Thaddeus Hargrave," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Nothing. Thaddeus Hargrave." A breeze stirred, impossible, given the stillness of the night. Thaddeus Hargrave. The gate opened, not with a groan this time, with a sigh. And there he stood, closer now, his face no longer blurred, gaunt, eyes like hollow wells. He raised a hand, not in threat, but in invitation. Behind him, the unmarked grave pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, like a heartbeat under the soil. "You've been called," he whispered, though his lips did not move. The words formed in her mind, clear as memory. "Not to join us, to remember us." Then she understood. The children, the grave, the silence. He wasn't haunting the cemetery. He was guarding it, keeping something deeper, something older, contained. But the seal was weakening, and it needed a witness. Someone who would carry the truth forward. Eloan stepped forward, just 1 foot over the threshold. The moment she crossed, the gate slammed shut behind her. But she did not panic, because in that instant she felt it, not fear, but purpose. The weight of history, yes, but also its duty. She spent the night in the cemetery, kneeling at the unmarked grave, speaking the names of the lost children aloud, names she'd uncovered in church records. Mercy, Josiah, and Eliza Croft. With each name, the pulsing light dimmed. By dawn, the ground was still. When she walked out at sunrise, the gate opened for her without sound. She never saw Thaddeus again. But every year, on the last evening of October, she returns. Not to watch from a distance, but to stand at the gate, speak the names, and remind the earth that it is not forgotten. And the gate? It opens for her now. Boys. Spring came late to Bridport that year. The snow lingered in stubborn patches beneath the pines, and the creek ran high and restless with meltwater. Eloan Voss kept to her routines, archiving, cataloging, walking the same quiet roads, but everything felt different now. Not frightening exactly, more tuned, as if the world had always whispered secrets, and she had only just learned how to listen. She no longer avoided the cemetery. In fact, she visited often, always in daylight, always with respect. She brought wildflowers in spring, dried lavender in summer, and on All Souls' Day, a single white candle placed gently at the edge of the unmarked grave. She never spoke Thaddeus's name unless necessary, but she felt his presence like a quiet hum in the air, especially near dusk. Then, in early April, a letter arrived. Not by email, not by town courier, but slipped beneath her front door one rain-slicked morning, sealed with black wax imprinted with a symbol she didn't recognize, a gate flanked by 2 weeping willows. The paper was thick, handmade, and smelled faintly of cedar and damp soil. Inside, written in elegant, looping script, were only 3 lines. Asterisk, the silence is breaking. They are waking. Come before the lilacs bloom. Asterisk. No signature. No return address. But Eloa knew. She drove to the cemetery that afternoon under a sky heavy with unshed rain. The lilacs along the roadside were still tight buds, weeks from flowering. Yet as she stepped onto the path, she noticed something new, tiny cracks spiderwebbing across several headstones, cracks that hadn't been there a week ago. And the earth around the unmarked grave, it was warm. Not hot, but unnaturally so, like sun-baked stone in midsummer, though the air hovered near freezing. She knelt, pressing her palm to the ground. A low vibration thrummed beneath her skin, steady, rhythmic, like distant drums. Or a slow, sleeping pulse. That night she dreamed again. This time, she stood not at the grave, but inside the cemetery chapel, a small, abandoned structure built in the 1850s and long since fallen into disrepair. Moonlight streamed through broken stained glass, casting fractured colors across rotting pews. At the altar stood Thaddeus, but he was not alone. 3 small figures stood beside him, their forms translucent, their faces blurred by time. The children, Josiah, Eliza, they turned as one and pointed, not at her, but toward the eastern wall of the cemetery, beyond which lay dense woods and the old tannery ruins. When she woke, her hands were stained with dirt. She hadn't left the house. Yet the scent of loam clung to her skin, and her boots, left by the door, were caked in mud from the eastern trail. The next day, she followed their silent direction. Pushing through brambles and fallen branches, she found what generations had forgotten, the foundation of Thaddeus Hargrave's tannery, half swallowed by forest. Among the stones and rusted tools, half buried in leaf litter, lay a small iron box. It was locked, but the key hung from a leather thong wrapped around its handle, cold to the touch, shaped like a keyhole within a keyhole. Back home, by lamplight, she opened it. Inside were 3 objects: a child's wooden doll, charred at the edges, a strip of cured leather stamped with strange symbols, and a folded map of the cemetery, hand-drawn, with markings she'd never seen before. The map showed not just graves, but lines, converging on the unmarked plot like veins feeding a heart. And at the center, a single word: threshold. Beneath it in smaller script, asterisk bound by memory, broken by forgetting, asterisk. Eloan understood then. The cemetery wasn't just a resting place. It was a seal. And Thaddeus hadn't merely guarded it. He had become part of it. His sacrifice, his name, his story, they were the locks holding something ancient at bay. But memories fade. Stories get lost. And when the last person who remembers speaks the names for the final time, the threshold opens. She began researching obsessively. She combed through church ledgers, town meeting minutes, even colonial court records. What she uncovered chilled her more than any ghost ever could. Long before Bridport existed, before settlers cleared the land, the Abenaki people had called this hill Quesakun, the place where the veil is thin. They avoided it after dark, warning that spirits walked there not because they were dead, but because they were waiting. European settlers dismissed the warnings as superstition, but some, like Thaddeus, listened and paid the price. By late April, the lilacs began to open, pale purple clusters unfurling in the cool mornings, filling the air with their sweet, melancholy scent. Eloan knew time was running out. On the eve of May 1st, the old Celtic festival of Beltane, a night when boundaries between worlds grow porous, she returned to the cemetery at sunset. She carried the iron box, the doll, and a journal filled with every name she'd recovered, not just the 3 children, but others buried without markers, forgotten souls whose stories had vanished with their headstones. She stood at the unmarked grave and read them aloud, one by one, voice clear and steady despite the wind rising around her. As she spoke, the ground trembled. Not violently, just enough to rattle the leaves. The gate behind her creaked open, though no one stood there. From the woods beyond the eastern wall, a low moan rose. Not human, not animal, but something older, hungrier. Thaddeus appeared then, not as a specter, but as a silhouette woven from shadow and starlight. He nodded once. Eloan placed the doll on the grave. Then the leather strip. Then the map. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "I remember you." The earth sighed. The wind stilled. The moan from the woods faded into silence. And the warmth beneath the soil cooled, returning to the quiet chill of ordinary earth. When dawn broke, the lilacs were in full bloom. Their fragrance drifted over the cemetery like a blessing. The cracks in the headstones had sealed themselves, smooth as if they'd never been. And the gate? It stood slightly ajar, not inviting, not warning. Just open. Eloan visits every season now. Not out of fear, but duty. She teaches local schoolchildren about the unmarked graves. She gives talks at the Historical Society about Thaddeus Hargrave, not as a ghost, but as a man who chose remembrance over oblivion. And each year, on the last evening of October, she stands at the gate and speaks the names. Because she knows now, some places are not haunted by the dead. They are protected by them. And as long as someone remembers, the gate stays closed. Summer settled over Bridport like a warm, heavy quilt. The days stretched long and golden, humming with cicadas and the scent of cut grass. Tourists began to trickle in, hikers drawn to the green mountains, photographers chasing the soft light over Otter Creek, and the occasional ghost hunter with EMF meters and too much confidence. Most passed the Bridport hillside cemetery without a second glance. To them, it was just another old graveyard, picturesque but unremarkable. But Eloan Voss knew better. She watched from her porch as a group of young men in matching t-shirts set up cameras near the eastern wall one humid July evening. They laughed loudly, joking about spooking themselves and daring each other to spend the night among the headstones. Eloan's stomach tightened. She knew what lay beneath that soil. Not evil, not malice, but something older than morality, something that responded not to fear, but to silence and forgetting. She drove down the lane just as dusk began to bleed into night. "Excuse me," she called, stepping out of her car with calm authority. "This cemetery closes at sunset. Town ordinance." One of the men, a lanky guy with a drone slung over his shoulder, grinned. Come on, ma'am. We're just filming for our channel." Haunted New England. You heard of it? "I have," Eloan said evenly. "And I've also read the liability waiver you didn't sign. Trespassing on consecrated ground after dark carries a $500 fine. Plus, the caretaker's dog is unpredictable." She didn't own a dog. But the lie worked. They packed up quickly, muttering about uptight locals as they drove off. Eloan waited until their taillights vanished down the road. Then she walked to the gate. It stood closed as it had every night since May. But as she approached, it opened, just a foot, silent and smooth as if offering her passage. She stepped inside. The air changed instantly. Cooler. Still. The crickets fell quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She walked to the unmarked grave and knelt. The earth was cool now, ordinary. But as she placed her hand on it, a single image flashed in her mind. A pair of eyes, deep and black, watching from the woods. Not hostile. Patient. Waiting. She whispered, "I'm still here." Nothing answered. But the tension in the air eased, just slightly. Over the next few weeks, Eloan noticed subtle shifts. The birds avoided the eastern trees. Deer tracks circled the cemetery but never crossed the fence line. And once, while walking the perimeter at dawn, She found a ring of mushrooms growing in a perfect circle around the unmarked grave, ghost pipes, pale and waxy, blooming out of season. Then came the letter. Not under her door this time. It was waiting in her mailbox, addressed in handwriting that matched the first. Same black wax seal. Same scent of cedar and soil. Inside, a single sentence. They are listening through the cracks in your world. Eloan's blood ran cold. That night, she reviewed every recording she'd made near the cemetery, audio files from her archival work, ambient soundscapes she'd captured for historical documentation. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but on the third pass, slowed to half speed, she heard it. Beneath the rustle of leaves and distant owl calls, a voice, dry, layered, ancient, whispering words in a language she didn't know. Except one phrase repeated like a refrain. Asterisk, Quesigurin. The Abenaki name. The place where the veil is thin. She reached out to the Vermont Indigenous Heritage Center, speaking carefully, respectfully. After days of cautious conversation, an elder named Nokomi's Wabin agreed to meet. They sat on Eloan's porch at twilight, sipping mint tea, the fireflies blinking like distant stars. "You've stepped into a story not your own," Nokomi said gently, her eyes sharp with understanding. "But you've done so with clean hands. That matters." She explained that Quesikuten was not haunted by spirits of the dead, but by what her people called alamkik, the ones who wait between. Not evil, but powerful. Neutral. They do not harm unless the balance is broken. The settlers, in their haste to claim land, had buried their dead atop this threshold, unknowingly reinforcing the seal with grief, memory, and ritual. Thaddeus Hargrave, whether he knew it or not, had become a bridge, a human anchor holding the boundary firm. But anchors rust, Nokomi said, her voice low. And stories fade. When the last voice that remembers falls silent, the waiting ends. Eloan asked what she could do. "Remember," Nokomi's replied. "Speak the names, honor the silence, and never let curiosity override respect." She left Eloan with a small pouch of dried sweetgrass. "Burn this at the threshold when the air grows heavy. It won't banish anything, but it will remind the old ones that you come in peace." Eloan did as she was told. On the night of the summer solstice, she returned to the cemetery just after midnight. The moon hung full and white above the hills. She lit the sweetgrass at the edge of the unmarked grave. The smoke curled upward in perfect spirals, carrying the scent of honey and earth into the still air. As the last ember faded, the gate opened fully. Not for her. From the darkness beyond the eastern trees, 3 figures emerged, tall, indistinct, moving without sound. They stopped at the fence line, just outside the cemetery grounds. Watching. Waiting. Eloan did not move. Did not speak. She simply stood, holding the empty pouch, her breath steady. After a long moment, the figures turned and vanished into the woods. The gate closed behind her with a soft click. Weeks passed in uneasy calm. Then, in late August, a storm rolled in. Not rain, but a dry, electric wind that made the hairs on Eloan's arms stand on end. The power flickered. Radios spat static. And at exactly 3 a.m., her landline rang. No one spoke. But in the silence, she heard breathing. Slow, deliberate. And beneath it, the faintest echo of children's laughter, distant, distorted, as if coming from underground. She hung up. The phone never rang again. By September, the leaves began to turn. Crimson and gold bled across the hills, and the air sharpened with the promise of frost. Eloan prepared for the cycle to begin anew. She gathered fallen branches, dried herbs, and copies of every name she'd recovered, now over 24 souls buried without markers, their stories rescued from oblivion. On the eve of October 31st, she returned to the cemetery at sunset, just as she had for the past 2 years. The gate opened before she reached it. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and something else. Ozone, like before a lightning strike. She walked to the unmarked grave and laid down her offerings. A pressed maple leaf for each name, a small stone etched with initials, and the original journal of Thaddeus Hargrave, now carefully preserved in acid-free paper. She began to speak. Name after name, voice clear and unwavering. Mercy Croft, Josiah Pike, Eliza Belweth, Silas Morrow, Abigail Finch, and on, until the last forgotten soul was remembered. As she spoke the final name, Thaddeus Hargrave, the ground trembled. Not violently, but deeply, as if the earth itself exhaled in relief. The gate swung shut behind her with finality. And for the first time she felt it, not just his presence, but his gratitude. A single crow landed on a nearby headstone, cawed once, and flew east. Eloan smiled faintly. She knew now that this was not a haunting. It was a covenant, and as long as she drew breath, she would keep it. Autumn returned to Bridport with a quiet intensity, as if the land itself remembered what was coming. The air grew crisp earlier than usual, and the maple trees blazed crimson by mid-October, their leaves falling in hushed showers that carpeted the roads in rustling gold. Tourists thinned out, drawn back to cities and suburbs, leaving the hills to the locals and the wind. Eloan Voss welcomed the solitude. She needed it, because something had changed. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a deep, persistent awareness, like the low hum of a tuning fork struck long ago and still vibrating in her bones. She noticed it in small things, the way her cat, Juniper, would stare fixedly at the eastern window long after dark, tail twitching, how the radio would sometimes skip between stations and land, however briefly, on static that sounded like whispering in a language with too many consonants, how her dreams no longer showed Thaddeus alone, but always with the 3 children standing just behind him, their hands clasped, their eyes wide with something between warning and plea. Then, on the morning of October 10th, she found the first marker. Not in the cemetery. In her own garden. Buried beneath the withered stalks of last summer's lavender was a smooth river stone, cool to the touch, etched with a single symbol, a gate with a crescent moon above it. She recognized it instantly. It matched the wax seal from the letters. But this time, the stone was warm, as if it had been held in someone's hand moments before. She carried it inside, placed it on her kitchen table, and stared at it for a long time. That night, she dreamed of the tannery again, but this time, it wasn't ruined. The wooden beams were whole, the roof intact, and inside, lanterns burned with a soft, blue-tinged flame. Thaddeus stood at a long workbench, not tanning hides, but carving names into thin strips of birch bark. Each strip glowed faintly as he finished it. He looked up as she approached, and for the first time, he spoke aloud, not in her mind, but with a voice like dry leaves and distant thunder. "They are counting the days," he said. "Not to escape, to be seen." She woke with tears on her cheeks and the scent of wood smoke in her room, though her fireplace had been cold for months. The next morning, she drove to the town library and requested every surviving Abenaki oral history transcript held in Vermont's regional archives. With Nokomi's Wabin's blessing, she was granted access to materials rarely shared with outsiders. What she read chilled her to the core. According to the elders, Alamkik, the ones who wait between, were not spirits of the dead, nor demons, nor gods. They were echoes of moments that never fully passed. Places where time folded in on itself, and certain events, certain choices, resonated so powerfully they left a scar in the world. Quesaqueten was one such scar. And the cemetery, built unknowingly atop it, had become a kind of anchor, its grief, its rituals, its names, all weaving a net that kept the fold from unraveling. But anchors require tending, and tending requires memory. On October 25th, a cold rain began to fall, a steady, gray drizzle that turned the roads slick and the cemetery paths muddy. Eloan waited until nightfall, then dressed in her thickest coat, tucked the river stone into her pocket, and drove to the hillside. The gate was closed. She stood before it, rain dripping from the brim of her hat, and said softly, "I'm here." It opened. Inside, the rain fell differently, lighter, almost hesitant, as if the sky respected the boundary. She walked to the unmarked grave and knelt, placing the stone gently on the earth. Immediately, the ground beneath it pulsed with warmth. Then, one by one, other stones began to rise. Not from the soil, from the air itself. Dozens of them, smooth and cool, each bearing a name she had spoken over the years. They hovered just above the grass, glowing faintly, forming a circle around the grave. And in the center of that circle, the earth split open, not violently, but like a flower blooming in reverse. From the darkness below rose a small wooden chest, bound in iron bands gone green with age. It settled onto the surface with a soft thud. Eloan reached for it. The moment her fingers touched the lid, images flooded her mind. Thaddeus digging the grave not for himself, but for the threshold. The children vanishing not by violence, but by choice, stepping into the fold to keep it stable. The townsfolk, generations later, unknowingly reinforcing the seal with every funeral, every whispered prayer, every name carved in stone. This chest was not a trap. It was a ledger. She opened it carefully. Inside lay hundreds of thin birch strips, each inscribed with a name, a date, and a single word, remembered. At the very bottom was a blank strip, and a small, bone-handled knife. She understood. To add a name, to truly bind it to the threshold, required a drop of blood. Not as sacrifice, but as covenant. A promise written in the oldest ink. Her hands trembled, but she did not hesitate. She pricked her finger, let a single drop fall onto the blank strip, and whispered her own name, Eloan Voss. The strip glowed. Then it rose from the chest and joined the others in the air, circling slowly like stars around a silent sun. The chest sank back into the earth. The stones settled into the soil. The rain stopped, and the gate behind her closed with a sound like a sigh of relief. She walked home in silence, the weight of her choice settling into her chest, not as burden, but as belonging. On the night of October 31st, as the moon hung low and orange over the hills, Eloan returned once more. She did not bring offerings. She brought herself. The gate opened before she reached it. Inside, the air was still. The unmarked grave looked ordinary, just earth and grass. But when she knelt, she felt it, a steady, gentle pulse beneath her palms. Not a heartbeat, a rhythm, the rhythm of memory itself. She stayed until dawn, speaking no names this time, just sitting in quiet companionship with the unseen. As the first light touched the headstones, she rose to leave. And for the first time, she did not look back. Because she knew she would always be part of this place now. Not as a visitor, not as a witness, but as a keeper. Years would pass. Seasons would turn. Tourists would come and go, never knowing the quiet pact that held the world together beneath their feet. But Eloan would remain. And every autumn, on the last evening of October, the gate would open, not for the dead, but for her. And she would step through, not in fear, but in faith. For some doors open not to let something out, but to let someone in. Winter arrived in Bridport not with a storm, but with a hush. Snow fell softly on the 1st of December, blanketing the hills in a silence so complete it felt sacred. The cemetery, now dusted in white, looked less like a place of mourning and more like a sleeping sanctuary, its headstones standing like sentinels beneath a sky of pale gray. Eloine Voss watched it from her window each morning, steaming mug in hand, her breath fogging the glass. She no longer felt dread when she looked toward the eastern slope. Instead, she felt a quiet kinship, as if the land had finally recognized her not as an intruder, but as part of its rhythm. Yet even in stillness, change stirs. It began with the dreams again, but different this time. No longer visions of tanneries or whispering woods, but of a woman, tall, with silver-streaked hair and hands stained with ink and soil. She wore a long wool coat like those from the early 1900s, and she stood always at the edge of the unmarked grave, facing away, as if waiting for someone to join her. In every dream, she would turn slightly, just enough for Eloine to glimpse the profile of her face, strong jaw, high cheekbones, eyes that held centuries of watching. Then, one morning in mid-January, Eloine found a photograph tucked inside a book she hadn't opened in years, a volume on early Vermont settlers, donated to the archives decades ago. The photo was sepia-toned, fragile at the edges, and showed a woman standing beside the cemetery gate, its iron bars sharp against the winter light. She held a ledger in one hand and a trowel in the other. On the back, in faded script, was written, * Maribel Hargrave. Keeper. 1907. *. Hargrave. The name struck like a bell. Eloine spent the next week digging through birth records, obituaries, land transfers. What she uncovered rewrote everything she thought she knew. Thaddeus Hargrave had not died childless. He had a daughter, Maribel, born in 1762, just months before his disappearance. She was raised by neighbors, told her father had gone west, but in truth, she'd always known. The journal she left behind, hidden in a false drawer of an old desk donated to the Historical Society in 1953, spoke of visits to the cemetery every autumn, of speaking names into the wind, of feeling the pull in her bones as she neared the unmarked grave. She, too, had been a keeper, and she hadn't been the first. Tracing the Hargrave line, through adoptions, name changes, and quiet disappearances from public records, Eloine discovered a lineage of women stretching back to the 1700s, each one drawn to Bridport, each one compelled to tend the threshold. Some were blood relatives, others were not, but all shared the same mark. They remembered when others forgot. They spoke when others stayed silent. And now, Eloine understood why the gate had opened for her. It wasn't random. It was recognition. On the coldest night of the year, February 3rd, when the temperature dropped to 20 below and the stars burned like ice, Eloine returned to the cemetery. Not out of duty this time, but out of kinship. She wore Maribel's coat, found folded in a cedar chest in the attic of her farmhouse, preserved as if waiting. It fit as though made for her. The gate opened before she reached it, snow swirling in its wake like breath made visible. Inside, the world was muffled, pristine. She walked to the unmarked grave and knelt, placing her palm on the frozen earth. "I know who you are," she whispered. And then, for the first time, the earth answered, not with tremors or whispers, but with warmth. A gentle heat rose through the snow, melting a perfect circle around her hand. Within it, a single birch strip surfaced, glowing faintly. She picked it up. Carved into the wood was not a name, but a date. November 2nd, 2025. Today's date. Her breath caught. She looked up. Standing at the far edge of the cemetery, near the old chapel ruins, was the woman from her dreams. Maribel. She raised a hand, not in warning, but in greeting. Then she pointed toward the gate. Eloine turned. Beyond the iron bars, on the gravel road, stood a figure, wrapped in a threadbare shawl. A child. Not a ghost. Not a vision. A real child, no older than 8, shivering in the cold, eyes wide with confusion and something deeper, recognition. Eloan ran. She reached the gate just as the child stumbled forward, barefoot in the snow. "Are you lost?" Eloan asked, kneeling, pulling off her scarf to wrap around the girl's shoulders. The child shook her head. Then, in a voice too calm for her age, she said, "I heard the names. I followed them." Eloan's heart stopped. "What's your name?" "Leora," the girl whispered. "My grandmother used to say them. Every autumn. She's gone now. But I remembered." Eloan looked back at the cemetery. Maribel was gone. But the gate remained open. She took Leora's hand. It was cold, but her grip was steady. "You're not lost," Eloan said softly. "You're found." She brought the girl home, fed her soup, wrapped her in blankets by the fire. As Leora slept, Eloan sat by the window, watching the snow fall. She knew now what her role truly was. Not just to remember, but to pass it on. The next morning, Leora didn't leave. She stayed, asked questions, listened to stories. And on the first day of March, when the ice began to crack on Otter Creek, she walked with Eloan to the cemetery. The gate opened for them both. That spring, Eloan began teaching Leora the names. Not as history, but as living breath. They planted lilacs near the unmarked grave. They cleaned old headstones together. And on quiet evenings, they sat on the chapel steps, watching the crows circle, listening to the wind move through the pines like a language only they could understand. By summer, Leora could recite every name from memory. By autumn, she dreamed of Thaddeus. And on the last evening of October, as the sun dipped below the hills and the first frost silvered the grass, Leora stood at the gate and spoke the names herself, clear, strong, unwavering. The earth sighed. The gate opened wider. And Eloan knew the covenant would not end with her. It would continue. Through Leora. Through whoever came next. Because some places are not haunted by the past. They are tended by it. And as long as there is someone willing to speak the names, the gate will open, not to let darkness out, but to welcome the light in. The years that followed settled into a rhythm as steady as the turning seasons. Eloan and Leora became a quiet presence in Bridport, two figures often seen walking the back roads, visiting the cemetery not with solemnity, but with the ease of tending a garden. Leora, now 12, carried herself with a stillness unusual for her age, as if she'd inherited not just the names, but the weight and grace of their keeping. She no longer shivered at the gate. She greeted it, and the gate greeted her back. It opened for her now without Eloan beside her, sometimes just a crack, sometimes wide enough to walk through. Never at random, always when the air grew heavy, or when the wind carried that faint, dry whisper from the eastern woods. Leora never entered alone. She respected the boundary, but she stood at the threshold often, speaking names into the dusk like seeds cast into fertile soil. Then came the summer of 2028. It began like any other, long days, fireflies in the meadow, the hum of cicadas in the oaks. But by July, the town noticed something strange. The creek ran slower. The wells tasted faintly metallic. And at night, dogs barked at nothing, their hackles raised toward the cemetery hill. Eloan felt it too, a pressure in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. Not dangerous, but expectant. One evening, while sorting through a box of donated papers from an estate sale in Middlebury, she found a map. Not hand-drawn like Thaddeus's, but printed on thick linen, dated 1913. It showed not just Bridport Hillside Cemetery, but a network of similar sites across New England, each marked with the same symbol, a gate beneath a crescent moon. There were 7 in total, and Bridport was at the center. Her hands trembled as she traced the lines connecting them. They formed a star, not perfect but deliberate. and at each point, a name was written in careful ink. Keeper. She showed it to Leora that night over stew and cornbread. They're all connected, Leora said, eyes wide not with fear, but wonder. Like roots. Yes, Eloin replied. And if one weakens, the whole tree trembles. They knew what they had to do. In early August, they began their journey. First to a coastal graveyard in Maine, where sea fog clung to the headstones like memory. The gate there was rusted shut, but when Leora spoke the names Eloin had researched, local fishermen lost at sea, children taken by fever, the iron groaned and swung inward, just once, before closing again. No figure appeared, but the air cleared. The metallic taste in the well water back home vanished the next day. Next, they traveled to a hilltop burial ground in western Massachusetts, overgrown and nearly forgotten. Here, the keeper had been gone for decades. Vines choked the gate, but Leora knelt in the dirt and recited the names she'd memorized from crumbling church ledgers. As she spoke, the vines loosened. The gate creaked open, and from the shadows beneath a yew tree, a woman in a faded dress nodded once before fading like mist. One by one, they visited the sites. In Rhode Island, they met an elderly man who'd been leaving wildflowers at an unmarked stone for 60 years, though he didn't know why. In New Hampshire, a teenage girl who'd been drawing the gate symbol in her notebooks since childhood. In Connecticut, a librarian who'd preserved oral histories of the quiet graves. Each place responded to the names. Each threshold steadied. But the final site, the seventh, was different. It lay deep in the forests of northern Vermont, near the Canadian border. No town nearby. No road, just a deer trail winding through spruce and birch. The cemetery there had no fence, no gate, just a ring of standing stones, moss-covered and ancient, surrounding a sunken patch of earth. This was not a settler's burial ground. This was older. Leora stopped at the edge of the ring. It's not waiting for names, she whispered. It's waiting for silence. Eloin understood. This was the heart of the star, the original threshold, the place where the fold began. They sat together at dusk, not speaking, not moving, just breathing, listening. Hours passed. The stars emerged, and then from the center of the ring, the earth exhaled. A soft, silver mist rose, forming shapes, figures holding hands, faces blurred by time, but radiating peace. Among them stood Thaddeus, and beside him, Maribel, and behind them, dozens more, keepers from every generation, every place, every story. They did not speak. They simply bowed their heads in gratitude. And in that moment, Eloin knew the truth. The gates did not exist to keep something in. They existed to remind the living that the dead are not gone. They are waiting to be remembered. When they returned to Bridport, autumn was already painting the hills in flame. The cemetery looked the same, quiet, familiar, eternal. But something had shifted. The air was lighter. The crows sang instead of cawed. And the unmarked grave, once a place of tension, now felt like a hearth, warm, steady, welcoming. On the last evening of October, as tradition now demanded, Eloin and Leora stood at the gate together. Leora spoke the names first, clear, strong, full of reverence. Then Eloin added one more, Leora Vale. The girl looked at her, eyes glistening. You're part of it now, Eloin said softly. Not because I chose you, because you remembered when no one else would. The gate opened wide, wider than ever before, revealing not darkness, but a soft, golden light spilling from within the cemetery, like dawn held in trust. They stepped through together, not as keeper and apprentice, but as equals. Years later, long after Eloin's hair turned silver and her steps slowed, visitors to Bridport would sometimes see two women at the cemetery gate, one old, one young, speaking names into the twilight. And if you listen closely on still autumn nights, you might hear more voices joining them. Whispers from the earth, sighs from the trees, echoes from the stones. Because the gate still opens. Not for the lost, but for those who remember. And as long as someone speaks the names, the veil remains thin, but the world remains whole. But peace, as Eloan would come to learn too late, was only the calm before the deeper dark. For years, the covenant held. Leora grew into her role with quiet grace, speaking the names each autumn, tending the threshold with reverence. The gates at the 7 sites remained steady. The earth slept. Then, on the 1st of November in the year 2031, Leora did not return from the cemetery. Eloan found her coat folded neatly at the base of the gate. Her boots lined beside it, and on the frost-covered grass, a single birch strip, freshly carved, still warm. It bore no name, only a date, November 1st, 2031. The gate stood wide open, not as invitation, as completion. Inside, the cemetery was utterly silent. No wind, no birds, even the crows had fled. The unmarked grave was no longer sunken. It was raised, as if something had pushed upward from below. And around it, the earth was scored with deep, deliberate grooves, leading away. Not toward the road, toward the woods, toward the old tannery ruins. Eloan followed the trail, heart hammering, breath ragged. At the tannery's crumbling foundation, she found Leora's journal, open to the last page. The handwriting was hers, but the ink was blacker than any she owned, almost wet, as if still drying. They didn't want me to keep the gate closed. They wanted me to walk through it. Thaddeus wasn't guarding the threshold. He was waiting for someone to take his place. I remember them all now. Even the ones who shouldn't be remembered. Beneath it, scrawled in a different hand, dry, spidery, achingly familiar, were 3 words. The silence ends. Eloan ran back to the cemetery, screaming Leora's name. But the gate had closed. And this time, it would not open, not for her, not for anyone. That night, the first snow fell. By morning, the entire cemetery was buried under a flawless blanket of white. No footprints. No tracks. No sign anyone had ever been there. Except for one thing. At the very center of the unmarked grave, a single bare foot, small, child-sized, pressed into the snow. And it was pointing outward. Toward town. Toward Eloan's house. Now, every evening at 6 minutes past 6, the gate creaks open on its own. Not wide. Just enough. And from within, a voice calls. Not Thaddeus's, not Leora's, but something wearing both their tones like borrowed skin. Hello, it's your turn. She hasn't slept in weeks. Because she knows the truth now. The keepers were never protecting the living from what lay beneath. They were feeding it. One by one. Name by name. Memory by memory. And the gate doesn't open to let someone in. It opens to let something out. Wearing the face of the last one who remembered. Thank you for listening to this continuation of Cemetery Gate Opens Itself, a true story from Blue Flame. If this tale of legacy, connection, and sacred remembrance moved you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice helps keep these thresholds open and these stories alive. Until next time, may your memories be kind and your silence full of meaning.